The first sip of Coca-Cola sent shivers down Antonio Rossi's spine, not from the coolness of the drink, but from the sheer impossibility of it. The glass bottle sweated in his trembling hands as he stared at the dark liquid fizzing inside. Around him, dozens of other Italian prisoners of war sat in stunned silence in the mess hall of Camp Hereford, Texas, each clutching their own impossible miracle. It was Christmas Eve, 1943, and the American guards had just distributed bottles of Coca-Cola to every prisoner, along with packages of cigarettes and chocolate bars. Outside, winter winds howled across the flat Texas plains, but inside the barracks, warmth spread as the prisoners raised their bottles in hesitant toast. "To Christmas," one American sergeant had said simply, before stepping back to let the Italians enjoy their gift. Antonio took another sip, the sweetness bursting on his tongue. Back home in Naples, he had heard of this American drink, this symbol of capitalism and excess. In Mussolini's Italy, such foreign luxuries had been denounced as decadent, then became impossible to find once the war began. Now, captured and thousands of miles from home, he was drinking it freely, given by the very enemies he had been sent to fight. How could this be? What kind of captivity was this, where prisoners received treats that civilians back home couldn't dream of? The bottle in his hand represented more than refreshment. It was a contradiction that threatened everything he had been taught about America. Major Emilio Dante watched his men from the corner of the room, his own bottle of Coca-Cola untouched on the table before him. As the senior officer among the Italian prisoners, he had maintained discipline and distance, determined not to let American kindness undermine the dignity of his position. Yet even he couldn't deny the change coming over the camp as Christmas approached. Guards who had been stern now nodded in greeting. The food, already more plentiful than what they'd received in the Italian army, improved further. And now this, Coca-Cola, cigarettes, and chocolate, handed out with casual generosity. "They're trying to break us with kindness," Dante muttered to Captain Bianchi beside him. "It's a clever strategy." Bianchi took a long swallow from his bottle, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. If this is how they break men, perhaps being broken isn't so terrible. His eyes drifted to the small Christmas tree the Americans had allowed them to set up in the corner of the mess hall. "My children at home won't have such treats this Christmas, not with the rationing." This was the truth that stung most sharply. While they sat drinking Coca-Cola in Texas, their families in Italy faced increasing hardship. Naples had been bombed. Sicily was occupied. Il government had surrendered months ago, though fighting continuava nel nord. Reports filtrati tra lettere e Red Cross bulletini pittavano un grim picture de civil life. Shortages di everything from flour to fuel, black markets thrivande where official supplies failed. Yet here they were, prisoners of war, drinking Coca-Cola like American school children. As Antonio finisce il drink, notò uno degli americani guardi watchendolo con curiosità. Le jovan Texan couldn't have been more than 20, con freckles splashed across his sunburned face. He approached cautiously, pointing at l'empty bottle in Antonio's hand. "First time with Coke?" he asked, his accent transformando le words into something almost musical. Antonio nodded, searchando for the right English words. "Si, yes, is very good, sweet." The guard grinned. "Wait till you try it with peanuts." "Peanuts?" "Yeah, you pour the peanuts right into the Coke bottle." "Trust me, it's a whole different experience." Antonio smiled politely, though the idea seemed bizarre. Why would anyone pour nuts into a perfectly good drink? But the casual way the guard spoke to him, not as an enemy, but as someone worth sharing a cultural secret with, left him feeling strangely disoriented. When dawn broke over Camp Hereford on Christmas morning, it revealed a dusting of rare Texas snow that transformed the drab compound into something almost magical. Antonio stood at the barracks window, watching as sunlight glinted off the white landscape. Even the coils of barbed wire atop the fence seemed softened, decorated with delicate ice crystals that caught the morning light. The night before had ended with songs, Italian carols from the prisoners, then American ones from the guards, the melodies drifting together in the cold night air. Some of the men had wept openly, homesickness washing over them in waves as they thought of families gathering without them. Others had found unexpected comfort in this strange communion with their captors, this temporary peace within the greater war. Now, as they filed into the mess hall for breakfast, another surprise awaited. The tables had been rearranged to form long communal rows, decorated with paper streamers in red and green. The smell of bacon filled the air, real bacon, not the powdered eggs and thin porridge they had expected. "Buon Natale!" called out Lieutenant Miller, the mess officer, his pronunciation terrible, but his smile genuine. "Merry Christmas!" For soldiers raised in fascist Italy, where Americans had been portrayed as gangsters and degenerates, this display of goodwill was more disorienting than any interrogation. Sergeant Paolo Ricci, a former baker from Milan, leaned toward Antonio as they collected their trays. "My brother is a prisoner of the Germans," he whispered. "He wrote that they get watery soup and moldy bread, while we feast like guests at a restaurant. How do we make sense of this?" Antonio had no answer. He had surrendered in the North African campaign, certain he would face harsh treatment, perhaps even execution. Instead, he found himself in a Texas camp where guards knew his name, where Christmas meant Coca-Cola and bacon, where the barbed wire sometimes seemed more a formality than a necessity. Captain James Wilson stood in the camp's small office, watching through the window as his men distributed Red Cross packages to the Italian prisoners. Each box contained items that seemed mundane to Americans, but brought wonder to the faces of the POWs. Coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, canned fruit, and small comforts like toothpaste and soap. "You're spoiling them, sir," remarked Sergeant Hughes, the camp's quartermaster. "They eat better than half the folks in town." Wilson shook his head. "They're still prisoners, Hughes, no matter how much Coca-Cola we give them." But even he had to admit that the line between captivity and hospitality had grown increasingly thin at Camp Hereford. The Italians were categorized as non-threatening prisoners. Many had surrendered willingly in North Africa after Italy's official surrender. They worked on nearby farms, helped maintain the camp, and caused far fewer problems than the German POWs held at other facilities. "I got a brother fighting in Italy right now," Wilson said quietly. "Could be he's a prisoner there. I'd want him treated decent." Through the window, he watched Antonio Rossi, a young private with a talent for drawing, open his package with trembling hands. The joy that spread across his face made something tighten in Wilson's chest. These were someone's sons, brothers, husbands, enemies by circumstance, not necessarily by conviction. The Christmas preparations had not been Wilson's idea initially. It began with a few guards bringing cigarettes to their work details, then expanded when local churches asked if they could send small gifts to the camp. The Coca-Cola had come from the regional bottling plant in Amarillo, donated when the manager learned that many prisoners had never tasted the drink. Wilson knew there were those who disapproved, citizens who believed prisoners should suffer, officials who worried about coddling the enemy. But here in this remote corner of Texas, far from the battles that had brought these Italians to American soil, different rules seemed to apply. The mess hall had been transformed for the evening's festivities, benches rearranged to face a white sheet hung against the far wall. As Antonio entered alongside other prisoners, he noticed American guards had placed a real Christmas tree in the corner, decorated with paper chains and a few precious ornaments. The scent of pine mingled with the lingering smell of the turkey dinner they had just consumed, a feast that left many Italians marveling at the abundance available even in wartime America. Private Marco Fellini, who had worked in a cinema in Rome before the war, approached the tree with wonder in his eyes. "In Italy now, there is no electricity for Christmas lights," he murmured. "My daughter writes that they use candles, and only for 1 hour to save wax." Antonio nodded, remembering letters from his own family describing shortages of everything: flour, meat, fuel. His mother had written about making coffee from roasted barley because real coffee had disappeared from shops years ago. Yet here he stood, his stomach full of turkey and potatoes, with the aftertaste of Coca-Cola still on his tongue. The contrast was almost physically painful. As prisoners settled onto benches, an American sergeant wheeled in the projector,
a magnificent machine that immediately drew excited murmurs from the Italians. Many had not seen a film since before their deployment, especially those from rural villages where cinemas were rare luxuries. "What movie will we see?" someone called out in broken English. The sergeant grinned. "It's a Wonderful Life. Brand new picture. You're seeing it before half the folks back home." This announcement brought a ripple of appreciation through the crowd. To be treated to a first-run American film seemed yet another impossibility in a day filled with them. As the lights dimmed and the projector whirred to life, Antonio found himself seated beside Captain Wilson, the American officer he had observed earlier. For the next 2 hours, the mess hall fell silent, except for the sound of the film and occasional translation whispered between prisoners. The story of George Bailey unfolded before them, a tale of a small-town American who discovers the value of his life through losing and regaining it. Though some of the cultural references were lost on the Italian audience, the themes of family, sacrifice, and redemption needed no translation. Antonio found himself utterly absorbed, transported beyond the camp to the fictional Bedford Falls. Beside him, he sensed Captain Wilson becoming equally engrossed, the officer's posture relaxing as the story progressed. By the film's emotional climax, when the townspeople gather to help their desperate neighbor, Antonio realized something extraordinary was happening in the darkened mess hall. Guards and prisoners, Americans and Italians, sat side by side, sharing the same experience, moved by the same story. For these hours, the war receded into the background, and they became simply men together, connected by their humanity, if nothing else. When the final scene played, an Auld Lang Syne filled the room, Antonio noticed something that startled him. Captain Wilson was wiping moisture from his eyes. This American officer, the embodiment of the enemy, had been moved to tears by the same moments that had affected him. It was a revelation more powerful than any propaganda, any political speech. As the lights came up and prisoners began to stir, Antonio heard Marco whisper to another Italian, "They say Americans are only interested in money, but this film, it shows something different about them." The days following Christmas brought a gradual return to routine at Camp Hereford, but something had shifted in the atmosphere. The barriers between guards and prisoners, while still officially maintained, had softened at the edges. Italians who once averted their eyes nodded to Americans they passed. Guards who had kept their distance engaged in halting conversations about the movie or asked about letters from home. For Antonio, the change manifested in unexpected ways. He found himself volunteering more readily for work details, not just to escape the monotony of the barracks, but because he had grown curious about this strange country that had captured him. Working alongside Texan farmers, he observed their methods, their machinery, their casual abundance. "How many acres you farm back in Italy?" asked one weathered rancher as Antonio helped repair a fence. "My family has 3 acres, Antonio replied in his improving English. "Good soil for tomatoes, some olives." The rancher whistled low. 3 acres? That's not a farm, son. That's a garden." The man meant no offense, but his words stung nonetheless. They highlighted a disparity that went beyond military strength to the very foundations of daily life. America's vastness, its seemingly limitless resources, made Italy seem suddenly small and vulnerable by comparison. No wonder they had Coca-Cola to spare for prisoners when their civilians enjoyed such plenty. In the camp library, a converted supply room where donated books were available to prisoners, Antonio discovered magazines showing American homes with electric refrigerators, automobiles in driveways, children with toys he couldn't name. One photo spread featured the American kitchen of tomorrow, with devices that seemed like science fiction, automatic dishwashers, frozen food compartments, built-in garbage disposal units. "My mother still cooks over a wood fire," he murmured to himself, tracing the glossy image with his fingertip. Major Dante found him there, poring over these glimpses of American life. The officer's face darkened as he saw what held Antonio's attention. "This is propaganda," Dante said sharply in Italian, "designed to make us feel inferior, to break our spirit." Antonio closed the magazine quickly. "Yes, Major, of course." But later, lying on his bunk, he couldn't erase the images from his mind. If this was propaganda, why did the Americans show it only in their own publications? Why did their guards live in quarters that confirmed rather than contradicted these visions of plenty? Such questions circulated through the barracks in whispered conversations. Men who had arrived, filled with fascist certainties, now harbored growing doubts. Not just about the war's outcome, which Italy's surrender had already settled, but about the very societies they had left behind, and the one that now held them captive. The full impact of Camp Hereford's unusual approach to prisoners became clear in February, when a group of newly captured Italians arrived from fighting in northern Italy. These men, who had continued to fight alongside German forces even after Italy's official surrender, entered the camp with rigid posture and suspicious glares. Their uniforms bore the insignia of Mussolini's Republic of Salo, the fascist puppet state established after Italy's armistice with the Allies. The contrast between these newcomers and the camp's established prisoners was immediately apparent. Where Antonio and his comrades now moved with relative ease around the compound, the new arrivals marched in formation. Where the original prisoners had developed workable English and casual relationships with guards, the newcomers maintained hostile silence. And when offered Coca-Cola with their first meal, they refused it as if it were poison. Collaborators, they hissed at the prisoners who accepted American cigarettes or spoke English with the guards. Traitors to Italy. Antonio found himself on the receiving end of such accusations from a lieutenant named Ferraro, a hard-eyed man with the physical bearing of someone accustomed to giving orders and seeing them obeyed.
"I see how you've all gone soft," Ferraro said during their first encounter in the barracks. "Drinking their drinks, watching their films, working on their farms like servants. Have you forgotten what it means to be Italian soldiers?" Before Christmas, such words might have stung. Now, Antonio found himself responding with unexpected calmness. "We haven't forgotten we're Italians. We've remembered we're humans first." The division between old and new prisoners grew over subsequent days. The veterans of Camp Hereford had developed their own culture, a hybrid existence that incorporated elements of American life while maintaining Italian traditions. They had organized classes in English and American history, formed a camp orchestra that played both Italian opera and American jazz, established a garden where they grew tomatoes and basil for homesick palates. The newcomers watched these activities with undisguised disdain. They held themselves apart, maintaining military discipline and rejecting American offers of education or recreation. When Captain Wilson arranged a special showing of films about American cities to help prisoners understand their temporary home, the original captives attended eagerly. The new arrivals boycotted the event. This became painfully clear one evening when arguments in the barracks escalated to shoving. A newcomer had found an American magazine under another prisoner's mattress and held it up as evidence of corruption. Voices rose, insults flew, and soon men who had fought in the same army were squared off against each other. Captain Wilson arrived with guards to restore order, separating the factions and establishing new sleeping arrangements. But the damage was done. The camp, once a place of surprising harmony, now contained a visible fault line. As Antonio lay in his bunk that night, listening to the low conversations of men still too agitated for sleep, he realized that Camp Hereford had become more than a prison. It had become a microcosm of Italy's own divided soul, torn between fascist past and uncertain future, between resistance and accommodation, between pride and pragmatism. And at the center of this divide stood the most unlikely symbol, a bottle of Coca-Cola, simultaneously a taste of captivity and a taste of freedom, depending on which side of history you had chosen to stand. By the time spring brought warmth to the Texas plains, the divisions within Camp Hereford had settled into an uneasy equilibrium. The newer prisoners maintained their separation, but had ceased active hostility toward their fellow Italians. Captain Wilson, displaying the pragmatism that characterized his command, had adjusted work assignments to minimize conflict while ensuring the camp's operations continued smoothly. For Antonio, these months of captivity had stretched into a strange interlude in his life, neither fully war nor truly peace.
He had learned enough English to read American newspapers, following the progress of Allied forces through Italy with complex emotions. Every town liberated was a step toward war's end, yet each battle report carried the possibility that his family's village had become a battleground. "I cannot make sense of this war anymore," he confessed to Captain Wilson during one of their increasingly frequent conversations. The American officer had discovered Antonio's talent for drawing and supplied him with proper materials, commissioning sketches of the camp for official records. Wilson nodded, understanding in his eyes. Wars rarely make sense to the men who fight them, especially toward the end. As they talked, a truck arrived at the camp gates, bringing the weekly delivery of supplies, including cases of Coca-Cola for the canteen.
Antonio watched as prisoners helped unload the familiar wooden crates, the glass bottles clinking inside. What had once been a Christmas miracle was now routine, as much a part of camp life as morning roll call or evening curfew. "Your Coca-Cola has conquered us more effectively than your tanks," Antonio said with a small smile. "Even some of the new men are drinking it now." Wilson chuckled. "Coca-Cola's been going to war alongside our troops since the Spanish-American War. The company has bottling plants following our armies across Europe and the Pacific. It's probably easier to get Coke on some Pacific islands now than it was before we got there." This casual comment revealed yet another dimension of American power: the seamless integration of commerce and conquest, the ability to maintain civilian comforts in the midst of global conflict. Italy had struggled to supply basic rations to its troops. America sent soda pop and cigarettes to the front lines.
On Independence Day, July 4th, Captain Wilson arranged a special event, a baseball game between guards and prisoners, followed by a barbecue open to all. The American national holiday became, improbably, a celebration shared by captors and captives alike. As they gathered on the makeshift diamond, Italians who had never held a baseball bat, trying earnestly to understand the game's rules, the strangeness of their situation struck Antonio with fresh force. 3 years earlier, he had been a young man in Naples, listening to Mussolini's speeches about the glory awaiting Italy and conquest. Now he stood under a Texas sky, wearing borrowed American sports clothes, preparing to play their national game while drinking their national beverage. The journey between those moments contained the collapse of one world and the opening of another. The guards won the game handily, though the Italians managed a few hits that brought cheers from both sides.
Afterward, as they shared barbecued beef and cold drinks, Lieutenant Ferraro, the most hard-line of the Salo loyalists, approached Antonio with an unexpected question. "This Coca-Cola," he said quietly, examining a bottle he had finally accepted, "what makes it so special to Americans?" Antonio considered the question carefully. "I think it's not about the taste. It's about what it represents. Consistency, availability, pleasure that doesn't change whether you're in Texas or Sicily. It's America in a bottle." Ferraro nodded slowly, then took a deliberate sip, as if finally allowing himself to sample the enemy's essence. His expression revealed nothing, but the act itself spoke volumes. Even the most resistant could not remain forever untouched by the culture that surrounded them. When victory in Europe was finally announced in May 1945, Camp Hereford received the news with a complicated mixture of emotions.
Per gli italiani prigionieri, immenteva la guerra che aveva attecato da loro casa fosse ufficialmente over, though molti avevano mentalmente concluso loro fighting mesi o anni prima. For l'americani Garzi immenteva l'inizio di un nuovo processo, preparando le loro cariche per eventuale ripatriazione. Il campo organizzò una modesta celebrazione, con extra razioni e una speciale film screening, ma la reale commemorazione avvenne molto più quietamente, in baracche dove men gaderano tu riflettere su tutto ciò che aveva passato e cosa poteva lei avere. "Will Italy still be Italy when we return?" wondered Sergeant Ricci, il fosto lined con concern. "Or will it be something new, shaped by American occupation, just as we have been shaped here?" Antonio aveva ben ascian similar questions. I suoi mostri recenti da casa descrivevano un'Italia già cambiante, American products apparendo in markets, American music playendo su radios, American words entrando nella lingua.
The transformation that had begun in captivity seemed to be occurring in the homeland as well. The day before his scheduled departure, Antonio sought out Captain Wilson to return the drawing materials he had been given. Instead, the officer insisted he keep them. "You have talent," Wilson said. "Maybe you'll draw what you find when you get home. Help Americans understand Italy the way you've come to understand us." The suggestion carried a weight Antonio hadn't expected. The idea that the cultural exchange could flow both ways, that he had something valuable to offer in return for all he had received. Their final conversation took place in Wilson's office, where a familiar red cooler stood in the corner. The captain reached inside and handed Antonio a bottle of Coca-Cola, beaded with condensation in the summer heat. "A tradition now," Wilson said with a small smile.
From Christmas to going away present. As Antonio accepted the bottle, their fingers brushed briefly, a human connection that transcended the official relationship of guard and prisoner. In that moment, Antonio saw not an enemy officer, but simply a man who had treated other men with dignity during extraordinary times. "I will remember Camp Hereford," Antonio said carefully, "not as captivity, but as education." Wilson nodded, understanding the complexities beneath the simple statement. "And we'll remember you boys. The way you adjusted, learned our language, worked our farms, makes you wonder what we might have accomplished together if we'd met some other way." The next morning, as Antonio boarded the train that would begin his journey home, he carried with him more than the small bag of permitted possessions. He carried memories of Christmas Coca-Cola and Texas barbecues, of baseball games and Hollywood films, of kindnesses small and large that had transformed enemies into something closer to friends. But perhaps most importantly, he carried a new vision of possibility, of what life could offer beyond scarcity and struggle, beyond the limitations he had once accepted as inevitable. America had captured more than his body. It had captured his imagination. Years later, when Antonio opened the first American-style cafe in his rebuilt hometown, he made sure that Coca-Cola held a place of honor on the menu. When customers asked why he favored this strange American drink, he would smile and say simply, "It's a Christmas tradition." Few understood the full meaning behind his words, but for Antonio, each fizzing glass bottle contained not just a beverage, but a story of captivity transformed into opportunity, of enemies becoming teachers, of a world larger and more complex than propaganda had ever allowed him to imagine. As travelers from America occasionally found their way to his cafe, drawn by rumors of authentic espresso served alongside improbable bottles of Coca-Cola, Antonio would sometimes share fragments of his story. And in these exchanges, the seeds planted during that Christmas of 1943 continued to grow. Small bridges built between former enemies, one conversation, one shared drink, one human connection at a time.